So we're bringing up the whole brain model in order to more or less map all these maps together. This is a map of maps, just like the flower of life is coming up in many spiritual communities is a kind of map of maps, a way of holding the complexities in singularity. Um, it is very much a truth that no matter where you are born in the world, um, that there are certain cultures or personalities that are more left leftwards as opposed to some cultures or personalities that are more rightwards. And this is what this model shows us, that there are four quadrants, very similar to Ken Wilber's integral theory, where there are the quadrants of the interior and the exterior and the collective and the individual. We might take that up at later videos, but for now, I find Ned Herman's Ned Herman's whole brain model a lot more clear and instructive when looking at the inner dance experience. Um, so, just as I mentioned, there are aspects of us that are leftwards. There are aspects of us that are rightwards. And in this model, it is showing to us that there are aspects of us that are more cerebral, and there are aspects of us that are more limbic. Um, we more or less know what cerebral mode thinking processes are. So here we look at logic, analysis, process of going through facts, or um, holistic, intuitive, integrative, and synthetic processes, as opposed to the limbic system. And this is ironic because what we find in this mirror is that there are actually male aspects and female aspects within the male and the female. So it would seem mostly that the left brain is basically the masculine, or the right brain might be the feminine. But when we look at the upper and lower regions, we do get a sense that the left aspect of the limbic system is more masculine, as opposed to the right aspect of the limbic system to be more feminine. That has some confusion in many ways because we might think that all things cerebral are more masculine based on the way we went over the Vesica Piscis, and that the lower version of this map, the limbic mode thinking processes, are more emotional. That is how we normally read about the limbic pathways, the mesolimbic pathways. The limbic system is basically the doorway into emotions. It looks at everything from decision-making process, the system of satisfaction versus dissatisfaction. It looks at the systems of rewards and punishment. So if I was to bring up the brain, the limbic system would be here, somewhere around here. It's localized, ironically. I say ironic mostly because I said localized, because the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe is here, but the cerebral mode thinking process is more or less this general area here. And I said the word ironic because it's the prefrontal cortex that actually localizes our awareness. And that when we do open up this very localized part of our brain, it's what brings us into regional awareness, um, which is the awareness of the field, the awareness of the metacognitive, meta-awareness being the awareness of the whole, or whole systems, whole systems thinking, whole systems feeling, whole systems intuition. Okay, so this is inner dance, really. Inner dance being a journey into the wakeful REM, the fourth state of awareness, the fourth state of perception, as opposed to the first three that are normally being looked at in basic psychology, being wakeful state, non-REM, and REM. That inner dance shows us, just like in the previous video, in that dialogue between me and Ash, that there is such a thing as wakeful REM. In some capacities, we look at this through the lucid dream, but through the inner dance, there's something about this fourth brain state that this isn't exactly lucid dreaming. It's very much going into the REM through more participatory approaches that isn't so dreamlike, but is still very much awake, but very much asleep. So what I'd like to go over today is what does it mean to go into that state? What does it mean to go into what does not look lucid at all, but in a very lucid way? What does it look like to both expand and contract at the same time? What does it look like to go into the part without losing an awareness of the whole? So that seems to be it. That is what is happening here. This is where we're going. Whereas maybe in one way or another, we are our own circles, and the other is another circle, but there is a growing sentimentality, greater sensing of what it's like to be the self and the other, to become aware of the shared space. This is why the Vesica Piscis is just a beautiful thing to look at, because of how it holds just so many things on what our points of integration, the meeting points of binaries and dualities are looking at. So let's go look at this model then. What I love about this is that it basically shows us right now where we are and where we are going. So if I was to draw maybe an arrow from here to there, okay, that we are coming from the sense of duality as we enter into a sense of the unitive. So if I was to bring this up, some of you know this as the flag of a certain country, which is South Korea. And it basically is one of the many ways in which we can look at the binary. Some cultures might look at that. One nation in particular would have their flag embedded in this symbol. Okay, it's the flag of Israel, which is just really another way of looking at that one. Okay, so one half of this model, depending on where you want to place it, would have that as opposed to that. Okay, so yin is basically a Chinese word, and it might be here based on how traditional Asian spirituality and a lot of energy process basically agrees on this notion that the awakening is an arising of an energy, a locked up potentiality or tension from the base, the sacral, the root upwards. So yin is a Chinese word that says inner vibration. That's how it's defined. So what exactly is it then that is waking up? It is what is intrinsic, that which is inside of us, and that which is also vibrating. So I bring this up because vibration is that. Vibration is to look at the nonlinear, and it is more of the limbic system that looks at the regional aspects as opposed to the localized aspects, which is what the cerebral mode does. It localizes as opposed to the limbic system, which regionalizes. So how does this work? How does that work? So knowing that the limbic system is here and the cerebral mode thinking process is here, what exactly then is inner dance? Going back here, something that I may be referring to is that there's a paradox built into this model. In many ways, we regard that the yin, in many ways, is in the limbic mode thinking process, and the yang is in the cerebral mode thinking process. But in many ways, we normally consider in cognitive developmental theories that the left brain basically holds the yang, and the right hemisphere of the brain basically holds the yin. So that when you do look at what the four quadrants represent, upper left A quadrant is the logician. When we speak about the roles most commonly ascribed to the quadrants, so maybe I'll put the letter L here. Logician. The lower left B quadrant looks at the role of the organizer. Lower right C quadrant looks at the role of the communicator, and upper right D quadrant looks at the role of the visionary. So this seems to be the destination or the goal. This seems to be the origins, and this bottom part here seems to be where a lot of the work is taking place when we talk about inner dance, and when we talk about all kinds of inner work or transformative processes. And inner dance seems to be particularly focused on lower right C. This is where a lot of the spontaneous movement happens, especially when you look at some of these words like interpersonal or feeling-based, kinesthetic, or emotional. So I would like to spend a little bit of time today to unlock what exactly that means in the way in which the brain unlocks, and I'm doing this step by step. So let's look at the limbic system. Going back here, what exactly is in the limbic system? We sort of touched upon this a little bit in some of the last videos. But right now, maybe let's look at the essence of what is being said. So I want to welcome you into the semantic network. Every single word that you might have ever heard represents meaning. So if you're familiar with semiology or semiotics or the science of meaning or signs, a word is a sign. So when you say the word text, or when you say the word structure, or when you say the word itself, this is a sign. And when you look at language, language is such a system of signs that any of these concepts or words or images basically lead us into a concept or an awareness of what exactly it means. Everything is basically made of energy, and when we filter information through the spiritual doorway called the brain, it will have to go through certain byways. And so it is that simple that we basically filter. So when you hear a word, when you hear text, structure is revealed, or structure emerges. What you might notice in the inner dance, especially exemplified in the last video in that dialogue between me and Ash, is inner dance seems to be a way in which the textuality of the life world starts to self-reveal itself as the inner structure upon which signs are merely a manner of a constant signification, or a chain of signification upon which a series of metaphors or metonyms, and everything is a metaphor. Your name is a metaphor. Your name could be a metaphor. It is sometimes a metonym, but your everything you're looking at right now, as your eyes revolve around the room or look at the screen of either your cell phone or your laptop or your tablet, all of these mean something to you, but they also don't. They are meaningless, but they're also meaningful. I don't want to go into semiology or semiotics for now. What I'd really like to discuss is in inner dance what we call the switch. There is an inverse relationship between these sections of the brain, upon which when you open one aspect, you also open one aspect. You would perceive the switch in some of the models that we've been looking at. So when you look at the vesica piscis, if you have facilitated, are facilitating inner dance, there is a very perceptual switch that happens. You will notice it in the music. You will notice it in the way people are breathing. You will notice it in their eyelids. Their eyelids are fluttering, going into REM states. there is maybe a tingling sensation taking place, and sometimes it could just be um, plain old crying, people beginning to tear up. Um, so the switch is a simultaneous the descent and ascent, and this maybe if I was coming from experience would happen somewhere in this region right here, where enough release as well as enough disintegration co-mixes with enough of this awakening and enlightenment embodiment scenario that comes with a lot of experience of energy in its numerous um, modes. So that is the switch. We would go back into the semantics of this one right here, um, from that spiritual model coming into this neurological model. The switch then is happening mostly in the limbic system, so that maybe if we go into another sectioning of the brain, we need to clearly look at the parts. The amygdala is more or less the emotional button in the mesolimbic pathway. The switch called the nucleus accumbens is the motor function switch. We've been speaking about the prefrontal cortex, which is the area where were it to be given the neurotransmitter called dopamine coming from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA. This brings about attention or focus. Attention. Whereas the nucleus accumbens, as we spoke of it before, is motor functions, and the amygdala is the emotional button. Okay, so the inner dance is basically a rerouting of neurotransmitters, especially dopamine. And so instead of sending dopamine, where we normally hold focus and attention, or beta consciousness, and instead of sending dopamine to the amygdala where we are holding emotional triggers, instead of sending dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, which is normally sending physical kinesthetic control scenarios into how we experience the central nervous system, there is a rerouting of dopamine, or the dopaminergic cycle from the VTA. It goes into these mysterious sections of people's brains, which is the brainstem. This is the primitive brain, is what they call it. And it's when we reroute basically dopamine into especially this area in the brain called the striatum. The striatum. That the inner dance comes about. So one semiotic system that we can use to describe it is something maybe you might see every day if you live in an urban setting. I'm not a very good artist, so this doesn't actually look like one. Let's try to correct it then. So what I'm trying to make here is a stoplight. So maybe not sure if this is green. This be yellow. It must be red. I'm not even sure what goes on top normally. um, the dopamine is very much the green light. Okay, so that is one of the simplest ways in which we can see um, how inner dance works. That when we reroute the dopaminergic pathway from the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and what's missing here, which is somewhere here, is the hippocampus. The hippo is the section of the brain that focuses on memory, and that's where the dopamine also normally routes to when we are in normal beta consciousness. So when we go into the circadian rhythms, it is in this part right here in N3 where a lot of this rerouting takes place. One of the things that needs to shut down when we go to sleep is especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, so this section is basically called the organizer, the planner, the thinker, the worrier. So going back then to Ned Herman's model, this begins to make sense. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is co-held by these two sections in the left hemisphere. So there's the cerebral mode thinking process left and the limbic mode thinking process left. So whereas this is the logical part, then this is the part that tries to organize the logic. This is where we see duality, and this is where we try to sustain duality, so that were we to look at this through the chakra system, logic might be placed somewhere here, as opposed to the organization of logic in many ways is held here, emotionally, energetically, or physically. So going back to this model of the brain, and let's not forget this model of the brain, when we basically activate the limbic system, but with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex off, we then hit the greening of the light, and that is what the switch basically means. It's the rerouting of neurotransmitters. So that is the signifier part. What we would have to look at is the deeper structure of the word. So what exactly does that mean? Okay, so I'm going to take a short break. I'm going to go back to this just to give some of this commotion outside the proper love and attention it deserves, and I will be back in an hour or two. Thank you for being here.